Good afternoon, and it is indeed my pleasure to welcome each and every one of you to the video conference that we have scheduled this afternoon. It's a very interesting topic, and with that, my greetings go to Ambassador Kamal for helping us organize this particular event, and we welcome the Dr. Jomo Sundaram, who is a renowned Malaysian economist with an educational background from the Penang Free School, Royal Military College, Yale, and Harvard. Dr. Sundaram is also an author of over 50 books, translated into 12 volumes, has written over 35 monographs, published numerous articles for the media. He is also the founder of the International Development Economics Associates, which is an organization focused on building a pluralistic network of economists who research, teach, and promote economic studies. The fundamental purpose of IDEA is to promote economic growth in disadvantaged countries. His work in advancing economic theory earned him the Vasily Leontief Prize in 2007. He currently serves as the Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development in the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, DESA. He is also an honorary research coordinator for the G24 Intergovernmental Group on International Monetary Affairs and Development since December 2006. So clearly, we are really privileged to have an opportunity to hear the Dr. Sundaram speak to us on the global financial crisis. Joining us in this video conference today are a few institutions. So we have Lock Haven University, Lehigh University, Towson University, as well as Fairleigh Dickinson University's Vancouver campus, Fairleigh Dickinson University's College at Florham campus, and Fairleigh Dickinson University's Metropolitan campus. My name is James Almeida. I serve as the Associate Dean for Global and Graduate Programs in the Silverman College of Business, and I'm also an Associate Professor for Entrepreneurship. Participating in this event today are also my students from my Entrepreneurship and Innovation class. We have been talking about innovation. We've been talking about the overall environment for innovation, and clearly when we talk about the environment for innovation, it is difficult to not talk about the global financial crisis. So clearly, at least speaking for my own students, they are looking forward to hearing you, Dr. Sundaram, share your perspectives on this issue. And so without much ado, I'll turn it over to Ambassador Kamal to take it from here, sir.
Thank you very much. You have made it much simpler for me to introduce Dr. Sundaram, Assistant Secretary General Sundaram, because you've obviously researched his eminent qualities in great depth. But that being said, I just want to add that this is a person for whom we have enormous respect and affection in the United Nations system. So welcome to this session.
Thank you very much.
With his permission and with yours, I would like to lead into the subject myself. We have serious problems in the economic situation of the world. Those problems are of 2 or 3 types. One of them is that we went into a period of globalization as an extremely powerful force, under the impression that globalization had a promise of lessening the inequalities in the world and of improving the development situation of the underdeveloped, wretched countries of the world. And in that promise, globalization has not performed at all. What it has done is that, in fact, poverty has increased in the world, and the gap has certainly doubled in the world in the past 20 years or 30 years. And so the promise of globalization is not visible as such. That is factor one. Factor two is that money, which is moving at an extraordinary speed in the world, almost $2 trillion a day, money moves without passports and without visas. Human beings cannot move in the world, but money can move without any nationality and without any obstacle or hindrance. So the concept of the border...
Oh, it's touchscreen.
The concept of the border, which stops human beings from crossing borders without a passport or a visa or whatever, does not apply to money. And that is odd, because we talk of human-centered consideration, but obviously the pocket is more important than the human in whose pocket we are talking about. Now, the result of this financial movement is that speculation has become extremely important. The money is moving because of speculation on the spread that exists between different countries. And so money moves according to the spread available in different countries. So the speculation is what led to the collapse of the Thai baht in the Asian financial crisis. And then, because Thailand trades enormously with Malaysia, it spread into Malaysia. Malaysia trades enormously with Indonesia, so it went into Indonesia, into the Philippines, into Japan, into Russia, ultimately to the United States. And the effects of that financial crisis, which is now 15 years old almost, can be felt till today in the volatility of the American market. And so speculation has destroyed the stability of the international financial system. And so the question that I want to ask Assistant Secretary General Sundaram is, here we are with an enormous system in the UN, which is the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, your own department, and your own personal commitment to development. But we are certainly not succeeding either in development or in financial stability. And so how is history going to judge our inability to control and to regulate the type of movements which have led to a collapse in the confidence of people in the world, with political consequences, economic consequences, social consequences? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Kamal, and thank you also to everybody else out there who's listening in. The question raised by Ambassador Kamal is a very important question, of course. The whole question of how globalization and its consequences have impacted on our lives, and the greater sense of vulnerability and precariousness which he has so eloquently emphasized. I think it might be useful at the outset to distinguish between different elements of what is often termed globalization. The term globalization is like the proverbial Indian elephant, with about 6 different people, 6 different blind men touching different parts of the elephant and describing them as the elephant. But if I may, I think 2 elements which are important in terms of understanding economic dimension of globalization would be trade and financial flows. And if we think about the role of trade, obviously there has been greater trade integration, and many countries, developing countries especially, have been forced over the last few decades to become much more externally oriented. And at least a dozen or so of these countries have done pretty well for themselves. They've been able to export increasingly, they've been able to grow on the basis of those exports. But for the vast majority, as you have correctly emphasized, Ambassador Kamal, the vast majority have not been able to take such great advantage. They have not been able to grow on that basis. And very often, we have seen during this period the decline of the so-called terms of trade. In other words, the prices at which your exports exchange for the goods which you import. And what we have seen is that the prices of exports have tended to go down and the prices of imports have tended to go up. Part of the reason, of course, is that most developing countries export primary commodities and they import manufactured goods. And however, in the recent period, there has been some change, particularly during the last decade before the crisis began. Some commodities did go up in price, especially mineral commodities. And the increase of prices of mineral commodities did benefit some. But of course, the number of people who are involved in mineral extraction is usually very small, and the implications of this were rather limited. Likewise, conversely, when we had more and more developing countries involved in producing many manufactured goods, we found that the prices of these manufactured goods did go down. So you have, for example, China becoming the manufacturing workshop for much of the world, and as a consequence of that, many of the industries in other countries not being able to successfully compete. So it wasn't just the developed countries, but even some of the earlier industrializing countries not being able to survive in competition. So this is largely what we often refer to as globalization, what might be referred to in terms of trade. However, we find that overall, over the last century or so, the prices of developing country exports have declined in relation compared to the prices of developing country imports. Now, there are of course other phenomena as well, which I won't get into right now unless you would like to discuss them later. But the other phenomenon, which has actually been far more significant, especially in the last 3 decades or so, is what is sometimes referred to as financial globalization. And the cross-border flows, which Ambassador Kamal correctly emphasized, have actually grown by leaps and bounds. I remember that in the mid-1980s, there was an attempt by the late Professor Peter Drucker, the famous professor of business, who attempted to estimate how much of cross-border flows had to do with real economic exchanges. And at that time, for 1985, he estimated that about 11%, only 11% of cross-border flows had to do with real trade transactions. By the time of the outbreak of the Asian crisis, which you just referred to, Ambassador Kamal, in 1997, I did a quick estimate, and by that time, for 1996, cross-border flows relating to trade accounted for less than 3%. Okay? So in other words, most cross-border flows have nothing to do with the real economy. Most cross-border flows are due to those controlling those funds trying to take advantage of very, very small changes in the exchange rate or in the interest rate and so on and so forth. So as a result of this, you have a great increase in volatility, a great increase in speculative flows. And all this, of course, has contributed to the kind of volatility as well as precariousness which we talked about. Now, what we have officially coming from the World Bank are figures which seem to suggest that poverty has gone down since the beginning of the 1990s until the middle of the last decade. However, according to the Food and Agriculture Organization, which attempts to measure hunger and undernutrition, they find that the number of people who are going hungry, the number of people who are less than well nourished, has actually increased during this period, and something is seriously wrong. Because if poverty is supposed to be a measure of the number of people who do not have an income to avoid being hungry, and that is the definition of poverty, how do we have, according to the World Bank, a decline in the amount of poverty in the world, and for the FAO, an increase in the number of hungry people. There is obviously something seriously wrong with our measures. So part of the problem, of course, is the focus on money as a measure of all this. And I suspect that this is part of the reason why we have this major discrepancy in terms of these trends. Now, if we go back to this question a little bit more, what we also see is a great increase in what you correctly pointed out as a big increase in inequality. Now, inequality in the world is usually measured in terms of income inequality, and the focus tends to be on national level inequality. So everybody knows that in most parts of the world, there has been, over the last 3 decades or so, a big increase in national level inequality in most countries of the world. Not in all countries, but in most countries of the world. The exceptions happen to be in Northeast Asia, countries such as the Republic of Korea, South Korea, as well as Northern Europe, the countries of Scandinavia and so on. But in all other countries, we have seen a big increase in inequality. So you have a combination of slow growth in the world economy before the crisis and increasing inequality. Okay. So what we do find is that there has been some increase in global inequality, but we should also remember that inequality among countries, among people of the world, is largely due to inter-country inequality. In other words, the gap between the rich countries and the poor countries explains more of overall world inequality than internal inequality.
But can I interrupt you here? Because my understanding was that according to the World Bank, in 1970, the ratio between the top quarter of the richest countries in the world and the bottom poorest, the ratio was 40-1. And now it is 90-1. So that means the gap, according to the World Bank, has doubled. So why are you so happy at the fact that the gap in inequality has doubled in 40 years? Or are you implying that those figures of the World Bank are questionable?
The reason we have that phenomenon is because that particular measure of inequality focuses on the richest 20 countries and the poorest 20 countries. That's one measure of inequality. But there are many other measures of inequality. And the measure of inequality which is considered to be, which is most popular, is something called the Gini coefficient. And the Gini coefficient takes into consideration the entire population of the world or the entire population of a country. And in this case, I'm talking about the entire population of the world. And as far as that is concerned, there has been a big increase in inequality until the beginning of the past decade. And in the recent period, all I'm saying is that there hasn't been a big increase in inequality over the past decade for a number of reasons, which I will come back to in a minute. The other point I would like to emphasize in this connection is that we often focus on income inequality, but in fact, wealth inequality is even greater than income inequality. And not only is wealth inequality greater than income inequality, wealth inequality has increased, has continued to increase until the crisis began a few years ago. And this is a phenomenon not only at the national level, it's also a phenomenon at the global level. So for example, Forbes magazine and other such magazines celebrate the big increase in the number of billionaires in the world. But this is of very little comfort to poor people. In fact, very often, the big increase in the number of billionaires in the world is largely due to higher cost of living for the vast majority of people in the world. This is the fact of the matter. Now, if I may just quickly turn to the second question you raised, Ambassador Kamal. What we have is, as you said correctly, a big increase in cross-border flows, much of it due to speculation, And associated with this increase in speculation is the fact that we have now a number of phenomena which were previously unknown. For example, there are a number of factors which accounted for the big increases in food prices around 2007, 2008, and again more recently. This increase in food prices is due to the fact that a great deal of money is now going into commodity markets, and part of the reason is because a lot of the other financial markets are now less attractive, and so those with money are speculating in areas which they were previously uninterested in. And as a consequence of that, we have much greater volatility, not only of food prices, but also of energy prices and other prices. So all this results in much greater price volatility, much greater inflation. It also often results in much greater precariousness of existence. Now, all this has got the original purpose of a financial system was to serve the interests of the real economy, was to bring together funds for investments which would enhance productive capacities, economic capacities, and improve broader well-being. What we have seen, however, very recently is that the concentration of such funds is being used to enhance speculation, to enhance short-term investments which are essentially of a speculative nature. And all this has contributed to the greater vulnerability of our lives. One big consequence, for example, is the fact that many, many young people all over the world now face the prospect not only of unemployment, but of having debt in order to acquire an education, but an education which will no longer be able to provide them with the means to repay their debt. And this, of course, has resulted in a great deal so we are likely to see a situation where many young people can no longer expect an improvement in their conditions of living, their standard of living, better than the generations before them. And in fact, they are likely to be worse off. So all this is relatively new, and it's due to the fact that we have a situation where the world economy has become subject to an unregulated or little regulated system where speculation is rife, and people are supposed to fend for themselves with very little protections from the vagaries of the market.
Yes, but the world is getting younger and younger, and so more and more young people are involved in the world, and they're not going to accept this. And so you will find young people, if they don't have jobs, they'll come out in the street. And that is part of the Occupy movement, that is part of the Arab Spring, and you will see that in other parts of the world. And because there is no way young people are going to be educated and then sit at home and say, we'll wait for the better days to come. So trouble is brewing around the world. But I want to bring you for one short question before we open to questions. And I just want to give early warning that we will be starting with Mercy and then Lehigh. And each university will be asked to come forward with 2 questions together, which we will take and then move to the next university. So first will be Mercy and then Lehigh. Now, Assistant Secretary General, you come from Malaysia. When we went into the Asian financial crisis, the going theory of the IMF was open your doors, let the market take care of the problem. Everybody had to obey the IMF, except for Malaysia, which said to hell with you to the IMF. It closed its doors, closed its borders, and said, we are shutting down. The result was that Malaysia was the only country which escaped quickly from the Asian financial crisis. In other words, the concept of regulation is critically important. Now we, except for Vancouver, which is in Canada, The rest of us are sitting in the United States, where there's a major debate going on between the Republicans and the Democrats as to whether regulation is moral or immoral. And it appears to people like me, who are based in classical economics, that this should not be a part of a debate at all, that it is the job of government to regulate, and that it should not be part of the public debate at all. But it is. And so, what are your views on this critically important problem of regulation, which is so central to the debate in the United States currently and during the whole of this year?
Ambassador Kamal, I wish you were right that the world is becoming younger, but in fact, the contrary is actually
no,
true.
only these people, only America and France and Germany is becoming old, and Japan. And I constantly tell them, import people from Pakistan, because we are very virile and we will create a better birth system in your countries. So import people from Malaysia and Pakistan to help the birth rate in these aging countries.
In many parts of the world, in developing countries, life expectancy has gone up a great deal. In China, in India, in Pakistan, and in many other parts of the world, life expectancy has gone up. It is 20 years ago, life expectancy in Russia went down by 6 years. In over a period of 5 years, life expectancy went down by 6 years. It is an unprecedented phenomenon. The GDP of Russia collapsed by half, and all this was due to this sudden opening up to market forces and a number of other phenomena during the period of the first period associated with President Boris Yeltsin. But let me go back to your question, which is a very important question, Ambassador Kamal, the question of regulation. We have seen since the late 1970s, after the election of Mrs. Thatcher and subsequently the election of President Reagan in this country, especially in the Anglophone world, especially in the English-speaking world and the richer English-speaking countries, a view which has become very, very powerful, that the government is basically parasitic, predatory, inefficient, incompetent. And very often the people who hold these views hold contradictory views. You have people, for example, carrying placards say, "Government, stay out of our Medicare." Okay? Even though Medicare is a government program, they say, "Government, stay out of our Medicare." Now, this obviously is a very contradictory view, but one should not assume that all views held are necessarily rational or necessarily consistent. But unfortunately, this happens to be the case. So we have this view which has been propagated very, very successfully. And part of the problem here is the information age. The information age has seen an explosion of information, and very often it is an explosion of information facilitated by corporations, powerful corporations, who use that influence to lobby for deregulation. Because when there's deregulation, they see their prospects for making money enhanced. And so we have seen over the last 3 or 4 decades a great deal of very, very influential and successful lobbying to try to reduce regulation in our lives. And this lobbying has been extremely successful. So you have seen the liberalization, or the deregulation, not only of financial markets, but also of labor markets. And in many countries, you have movements to get rid of the minimum wage. In in a recent presidential candidate has been advocating the return of the 60-day work week. Okay, and this is a view of a legitimate presidential candidate. Sorry, 60-hour work week. Sorry, not 60-day work week. A 60-hour work week. These are views which are now considered legitimate, which are where there is actual strong public support, and part of the reason is because of misperceptions. There's a new book about the Tea Party movement in this country, and the Tea Party, and many people associated with the Tea Party movement are actually older people who feel that younger people are living off them, younger people are sponging off, and that they have less of a work ethic, they are less committed, they do not see and understand that unemployment is not a choice of younger people. It is a predicament which they face. But nonetheless, these views are passionately held, and such people actually believe that government interference, government programs actually take away from them and benefit the parasitically poor. So it is the less poor who are resenting what is being taken away from them, ostensibly in the interest of the poor. They don't quite realize that the major beneficiaries are those who are becoming super rich. And we have seen this phenomenon of the number of billionaires in the world increasing manifold over the last 2 or 3 decades. But this, unfortunately, is not something which is within the consciousness of many of these people who are campaigning against regulation, who are campaigning against taxation, who are campaigning against the ability of the government to do anything to protect the interests of the most vulnerable in society.
Let's take a couple of questions from Mercy.
Well, my name is Andy Frame, Ambassador. I met you at Mercy with the Undersecretary or Under Ambassador of the European Union at the talk last semester. The question that I have is, in what way can the United Nations assist in regulating transnational financial flows?
Okay, let's take a second question. Does Mercy have a second question?
No, we don't.
Okay. The question is, can the United Nations do anything about transnational flows? And what is your relationship with the IMF, which has, after all, a mandate regarding financial stability and financial flows?
This is a very interesting and important question, because it really shows how very often people do not act in their own self-interest when they are persuaded by powerful ideologies. Under the IMF's Articles of Agreement, Article 6, Section 3, the IMF provides for all countries, all sovereign members of the IMF have the right to impose capital controls of the flow of funds among countries. This is a sovereign right which all countries have. Unfortunately, although this is the practice, in recent decades, many of the staff of the IMF have actually been advocating the contrary, against the Articles of Agreement of the IMF itself. And so, as a consequence of this, many people in the world, many governments in the world, do not realize that they have these rights provided for as part of their membership of the IMF, and instead they eschew the right to impose controls on capital flows among countries. Very often, also, in engaging in so-called free trade agreements or bilateral investment treaties, usually with a powerful, richer country, they also eschew or deny themselves the right to exercise those controls. So this becomes a huge problem. You will find that although over 100 countries in the world actually have capital controls of some kind or another, including the United States, by the way, in terms of how they present themselves, they are in denial. They deny that they have these regulations. Why? Because they want to be favorably judged by the financial media. They want to be favorably judged by Forbes magazine, Fortune magazine. They want to be favorably judged by Bloomberg and so on and so forth, where the prevailing presumption is that capital account regulations, capital controls are not in a country's best interest. So this view that money flowing easily across borders is actually desirable has become so powerful that governments, finance ministers, central bank governors actually deny to themselves the rights which are given to them under the Constitution or the Articles of Agreement of the IMF.
Let's take a couple of questions from Lehigh.
Hi, good afternoon, Ambassador. Thank you so much for your talk. My name is Sharon Tang, and I'm a freshman studying finance and electrical engineering at Lehigh. And I would just like to ask you the following question. I was wondering what you suggest that young people should be doing to help with the financial crisis and help raise their financial statuses.
Okay, second question.
In America, we seem to have two strategies to stimulate growth, either top up or bottom down. Which do you feel would be most beneficial in stimulating growth globally? Top down or bottom up? Sorry.
Can I take the first question myself? And I want to take that first question about youth for the simple reason that, in my opinion, the most productive years that you have are between the ages of 20 and 30. And there is enormous evidence that that is when your body, your brain is at its best in terms of creativity. And if you look at the history of creativity, you will find numerous examples of people who have contributed. There's a girl at age 18 who becomes the commander-in-chief of the French army and defeats the British army. You have another girl at the age of 18 who becomes the queen of Egypt and is by far the most intelligent woman with the geopolitical knowledge that has ever ruled pharaonic Egypt. You have a young chap of the age of 26 who conquers half the world and really conquers it and leaves an impact. You have another person of 27 who writes the most beautiful music and dies at the age of 28. And so do it when you are young, and do not let anybody who is over 30 years old stop you from knowing how important you are to yourself and to the world. And the second point is that you have today at your disposal force multipliers. You have the internet, you have Twitter, you have Facebook. And so each one of you individually is as powerful and perhaps even more powerful than the president of the sole surviving superpower in the world. And so exercise that power and understand how powerful you are, and don't let anybody cow you down. Over to you for the next question, sir.
Well, I'm a little lost with the...
You're lost because you're over 30.
True. I'm not sure what a bottom-up versus a top-down approach, what those refer to. But let me describe what I see as the two approaches which currently exist. One approach, which is favored by the government of Canada, many governments in Europe and elsewhere, is to say that what we need is to get rid of our government debt. Get rid of government debt, and when you eliminate government debt, you don't borrow, you don't spend. When you eliminate government debt, or at least reduce government debt, financial markets will have confidence in you, and that will mean that investments will start growing, and when investments start growing, jobs will be created, and so on and so forth. This is one view of how economic recovery is going to take place. This view has never been realized. It wasn't realized when Herbert Hoover was the President of the United States up to the early 1930s. It is not a view which did not prevail, did not succeed. If we look very carefully at the record of what happened during the 1980s when economic recovery did take place, economic recovery did take place, but it not because of these for these reasons. And the other view is a view which is associated often with the thinking of an English economist named Keynes. But in fact, many of his ideas were anticipated by others as well. The view was that you basically need not overly worry about debt. What you need to do when the market fails is that you need to undertake what are called counter-cyclical policies. And counter-cyclical policies in a period of economic recession, of economic slowdown, of economic depression, means that the government needs to stimulate, needs to spend more. And this becomes very important. Particularly in developing countries, this spending should be in the area of creating infrastructure, maintaining infrastructure, and as the Chinese would say, today's jobs, namely in infrastructure, are tomorrow's capacities. And this becomes very important. But also in other countries, for example, in the United States, very important changes could be undertaken, which would have huge opportunities, create huge opportunities for job creation and in new areas. Part of the problem right now is that because interest rates were low before the crisis began, many investors were able to borrow money very cheaply and to invest in a whole number of areas where they thought they could make money. As a consequence of that, we find that in most of those traditional sectors, there is already overinvestment. There is excess capacity. There's underutilized potential. And so, right now, even though you keep interest rates down, nobody wants to invest in those sectors. Why? Because there is this overhang of existing capacity. What you need to do in those circumstances is to stimulate investments in areas which are underinvested. Underinvested perhaps because the profitability of those investments might be modest, or because there are no enabling investors. For example, just think about it. If you wanted to try to slow down global warming in the world, if you wanted to do so by encouraging the switch to electric cars, you couldn't do so by yourself. You would need a certain degree of infrastructure which would facilitate the use of electric cars, of charging of electric cars, perhaps at night, and so on and so forth. Now, all this would involve a lot of jobs, creating jobs which would which would be involved in supporting the infrastructure for a new economy based on electric cars rather than on gasoline-driven cars. This would this would not require the four-stroke engine which currently is used to run cars. It would require a different, much simpler technology, in fact, but a technology where there is still much room for opportunities for work and so on and so forth. All this would be done, but it cannot be done unless the government makes the decision to make that kind of a switch. Likewise, you can make other kinds of decisions as well in poorer countries, perhaps for greater food production and so on and so forth. But all these decisions require a degree of leadership which only the government can undertake, through investments, through regulation, as you correctly pointed out, Ambassador Kamal, as well as in a number of other areas. So all this needs to be done, but the role of government leadership becomes crucial. I'm not suggesting that there will be no temptation for abuse and so on and so forth, but this can be minimized through checks and balances of various types, through greater transparency and accountability, which is now made easier by the availability of new technologies to facilitate transparency and accountability.
Let's take two questions from Lockhaven and then two from Towson.
Thank you, Ambassador Kamal and Dr. Sundaram. LHU students have two questions. The first is, do you believe that partisanship in a developed nation like the U.S. is a detriment to the government facilitating economic growth during this financial crisis? That's the first. Our second question is, why is it that the UN does not take economic crimes as serious as it does terrorism, nuclear threats, etc., by demanding that the speculators who cause these crimes be prosecuted fully, since their activities affect literally everybody?
Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much for those questions. So let me deal with the second question first. I don't think the UN has a very strong convention against corruption. The fact that but the UN does not have the capacity to act on these matters. It really requires member states, countries themselves, to implement the convention against corruption, to have the necessary legislation, to have the necessary prosecution to deal with those economic crimes. So I would simply say to you that it would be extremely important to have greater international cooperation through the UN to enable, to facilitate the prosecution of economic crimes, but also to facilitate cooperation in a number of areas. Let me give you one example. One of the big problems we face in the world today is the whole problem of governments not having the kind of fiscal capacity which is needed to deal with these problems. But part of the reason for this, of course, is that there are so many tax breaks and tax loopholes and tax evasion going on in the world, and only through cooperation among governments would we be able to minimize such abuses of the taxation system. And so the cooperation among governments through inclusive multilateral forums, and there's nothing else but the UN for this purpose, is really crucial to addressing what you referred to as economic crimes.
No, but I think we have to go deeper into this, because you have examples of economic crimes. For example, the Bhopal case, or for example, the Nigeria, the Shell oil case, in which the crime is being committed partly by the foreign transnational corporation and partly by the local government in acquiescence. And in other words, it's a marriage between the greed of the transnational corporation and the greed of the poor governance of the local government. Now, the central point of this is the importance which is being given to money as opposed to the concept of welfare and happiness. And so the concept of welfare as opposed to wealth is a fundamental concept in all spiritual teachings, but we seem to have forgotten them. And if you forget your spiritual underpinnings, then I'm afraid you are going to continue to have what are called economic crimes.
I cannot disagree with what you've said, Ambassador Kamal, but let me just give you a very simple and practical example of what the lack of cooperation actually means in the case of Tanzania. Tanzania is now the third largest gold producer in the African continent, after South Africa and Ghana. Tanzania actually continues to subsidize gold mining by foreign companies in Tanzania. Why? Because it received advice from an international bank, which shall remain unnamed for the present purposes, to subsidize through provision of infrastructure and other tax breaks and so on and so forth, investments by foreign companies in the gold mining sector. So you have this ironic situation of one of the poorest countries in the world subsidizing gold mining activities by some of the richest corporations in the world. Now, many people would not say, would insist that no crime has been committed, but I would insist that by any norm, any sense of decency, I'm sure we would all agree that this is simply unacceptable. But unfortunately, this is very much the nature of the beast today. And very often, if we look at the fine print of investment treaties and free trade agreements, all this is facilitated by such international understandings. Let me go back, if I may, to the first question, and that is about the role of partisanship. I think what we do have in the world today is very different views of the world, and I think what we have seen is that the partisanship which you have in this country and in a few other countries has become very, very closely associated with particular views of the world. And so one party in this country is now very, very closely associated with a view that the best role of government is the minimal role for government. This has not always been the case. If we look at the history of that same party over time, we would see that there was a time when that party, the leader of the party, the President Eisenhower, for example, warned about the rise of the military-industrial complex. He was very aware about how dangerous the collusion among business interests and the collusion between business and military interests would be, not only for the United States but for the world. And this was within Ambassador Kamal's lifetime, even within my lifetime, although I was too young to appreciate the speech when it was made. So, and this is a very recent phenomenon. And part of the reason, of course, is that you have an electoral system which many people would say is the best electoral system money can buy, where lobbying is very legitimate, where you can raise money, and corporations are considered to be citizens, as ruled by the Supreme Court some years ago, and so on and so forth. So the range of issues involved here, which have led to the kind of very simple kind of debates over very important public policies, are often limited by partisanship. But I would say that we also find in some situations some very, very curious turns where a socially conservative politician may also take the view that the role of government is actually to protect that society. And this is true, for example, of Bavarian politicians Bavarian politicians who are very socially conservative, but also think that it is the responsibility as commanded by the Catholic Church in their view for the state to be protective of the poor, protective of those who would otherwise not be protected otherwise. So you can have very, very interesting turns, but what unfortunately has taken place over time in this country is that there is you have more important than the polarization which is referred to as partisanship. You have the powerful influence, powerful corporate influence, which is now been made legitimate by the very limited controls on what can be done by corporations in terms of influencing the political system.
Let's take two questions from Towson, and then I will come to Vancouver.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Kamal. We have two questions for you.
Good afternoon, ambassadors. Thank you for being with us. My name is Amanda Fennell, and I wanted to ask you, in regards to humanitarian efforts with plans for long-term sustainable investment in developing countries, what does the UN suggest might be the best approach? Would you advocate for a market-based solution or increased investment in education for these developing countries?
And my name is Sam Wilgus, and as you said, most developing countries mainly export commodities. Countries such as these are not able to generate a consumer middle class because of the lack of wage-paying jobs that are found in industrialized and manufacturing countries. So my question is, what regulations could be placed to give these developing countries a fair shot in manufacturing at an international level, and so they can industrialize and have more infrastructure?
Great questions.
Thank you for those questions. I do think in modern societies there is a very important role for markets. Markets can provide can combine and summarize and present a lot of information in the form of price signals. But I do think what should be indicative should not be dominant. And so we should not be slaves to the market. Rather, we should use the market because it provides very useful information, useful signals to respond to changing conditions, but not to allow the market to dominate human and social life. And that unfortunately has been the trend in recent years. So the investments which are needed are investments in human resources. You mentioned education. I would also emphasize health and nutrition. I would also emphasize the need for very basic things like clean water, potable water, in terms of sanitation and facilities, having a roof over your head, and so on and so forth. These kinds of investments are needed in many societies, and often there are very difficult trade-offs to be made between these different types of investments. And I'm not suggesting that there is a simple formula, one size fits all for all of humanity. But I do appreciate the fact that you have raised this dilemma which we often face about how to deal with markets. I do not think that in our day and age it is possible, let alone desirable, to get rid of markets. At the same time, I do think that it is dangerous for markets to take over our lives, because behind those markets are very, very powerful corporate interests, and we do not have a level playing field. We do not have a world of perfect competition, which you learn about in textbooks, because it is a convenient device for learning purposes. But we do not live in a world of perfect competition. We live in a world very often of monopoly, or at best what is politely called oligopolistic competition. The other question, which was, I'm sorry, I didn't quite, I'm not sure I completely caught the other question, but I do believe that it is very important, while accepting market signals, for governments to play a very important role in accelerating development. And this is possible. This is possible. To do so. Unfortunately, very often, due to international, to some of the international rules which have come about, for example, through the WTO, the World Trade Organization, or some of the other rules which I have not talked about yet, we find that governments, national governments, have been deprived of what is called policy space, the ability to make policies in the best interest of their own populations and in order to achieve development. And so it is very important to have the space. It is also very important to have the means to be able to use that space. We have seen, for example, recently President Obama's economic advisor, Gene Sperling, recognizing the importance of something called industrial policy. But basically what it involves is shaping the investment decisions of private investors, of shaping the technological decisions of enterprises. And all this can be made possible, can be facilitated if you have much more of a level playing field than currently exists. Unfortunately, in the world today, we do not have that kind of level playing field, and certain kinds of property rights are given so much prominence, very often at the expense of human rights. And this, I think, is very, very unfortunate. We have the means, for example, to address a whole range of diseases in the world, but the ability to do so is compromised by the fact that intellectual property rights are held by powerful pharmaceutical corporations, which then limit the ability of that knowledge to be used and deployed for the purposes of eradicating disease, of improving the human condition.
But talking about knowledge and education, there is a general feeling that all that you need is education and it will automatically create development. It doesn't happen like that. There are dozens of countries which have, Sri Lanka has 99% literacy. It has better literacy than the United States, but it remains a very unfortunate country. So it appears to me that the key is not so much in education as in job creation. And if you have job creation, which is development, then education follows automatically. And so I hope you agree that inadequate attention is being paid to development activities in the world. It is development which was such an important word from 1945 to 1990 in the UN has unfortunately become a dirty word subsequently.
No, you're absolutely correct. There's no way we can we can reduce poverty in the world if people do not have decent jobs. All that is certainly very true. In neighboring Kerala state in India, for example, you have more than 99% literacy as well. And we find that high level of literacy has resulted in a situation where many people from Kerala state have migrated all over the world, within India as well as beyond India, and the lingua franca in some hospitals during the graveyard shift between midnight and 8 a.m. in the morning is often Malayalam, the language of the people of Kerala. And the reason this is so is because both nurses and doctors are trained in Kerala, but they do not have jobs in Kerala, and they go abroad. And this is a part of the problem that we have not seen enough job creation within Kerala itself, partly because of the lack of investments, but this too is beginning to change. But you are absolutely right that education alone is not going to solve these problems, but it is an important component of the solution, especially if it can lead to improved employment.
Let's go to Vancouver for 2 questions, followed by Florum.
Ambassador Kamal, I'm sorry to say, but you only have 10 minutes, so that's it. Because there's a meeting coming in at 1:30.
We refuse to be terrorized by an Indian technician at TNEC.
Unfortunately, I have the remote in my hand and you don't.
Over to Vancouver.
Ask quickly.
Well, good morning from Vancouver. My name is Mac. My question for you is that we are seeing an economic meltdown in Europe with the default of Greece economy, soon spreading to Italy, Portugal, and etc. Now, the meltdown is mostly due to the huge debt that these countries are unable to pay. What's funny for me is that you were talking about how we should not be too worried about the debts. But if you look at the figures of the debts that these countries have, it's just crazy and it's just impossible to pay off the debts. So my questions for you is there any other way for this country to get out of their debts? Because I believe that the governments can't keep asking the Fed and the central banks to keep printing money to pay for the debts, to buy out the debts. And I'm not ready to trade gold for my food should that doomsday come when money is just a piece of paper. Thanks. That's my question.
Do you have a second question?
Yes. The second question is that do you think that reducing regulations in a country such as Canada that has like regulations for everything would bring a successful program or a successful outcome after reducing them?
I take the first question because I have strong views, stronger views than you have on this question of European debt. The problem of European debt in Greece and tomorrow in Spain and day after tomorrow in France is not a European problem. It is a problem which has been planted in Europe by the United States. It is the United States which has come out with this theory that you can consume without worrying about what you produce. And so this country is producing less than what it is consuming. You know that 75% of the American economy is consumption. And it is consumption which is not met by production. And the balance, the debt, the US debt, is being paid by China and Germany and Japan. Now, once you begin believing that you can consume without worrying about production, then it's a very easy thing which flows over the Atlantic into Europe. And so the Greeks and the Spaniards and the Mediterraneans and the French said, if the Americans can do it, so can we. And so ultimately in Europe, the problem is that the Mediterranean countries have picked up an American policy, and only Germany is working harder than it is consuming. So ultimately they are milking Germany to pay for all their debts, which are the result of overconsumption. Please criticize me if I'm wrong.
Well, since time is limited, let me be very quick on this. Firstly, I think it's very important to recognize that that countries can borrow a great deal, even higher, much more than European levels. The Japanese debt in relation to annual output is more than double even the highest European debt. Okay, the Japanese debt level is about 230%. The countries you are very concerned about have debt levels of about 100%. But let's remember that this debt level went up from about 60% to about 100% very recently. Why? The debt was incurred to save the financial system, to save the banking system. So the banking system was very happy to ask for and demand that the governments save them. And once they have been saved, the whole situation turned around, and they said, now that we've been saved, let's forget about everybody else who's in trouble, and let's not increase our debt. So I think there's a moral issue involved there as well. But I think the European situation is very diverse, and it's very difficult to mix it all up. In the case of Greece, they were undertaking, the Greek government was fraudulent, and this was actually facilitated by a Wall Street firm. This is well known. But also very importantly, the top 15,000 Greek taxpayers evaded an average of $5 million each in taxes. They were not paying taxes. So you cannot sustain that kind of a system. So I'm not suggesting that, therefore, that you just spend and not worry about the consequences. What we have in the Greek situation is a fraudulent situation undertaken largely by the richest people of that country, where they were not paying taxes, and the Greek government took on a lot of liabilities. But that's not the situation in the other countries. Let's be very, very clear about it. And other countries, the problems are different, but as I said, unfortunately, there's no time to discuss all of them. As far as Canada is concerned, I think everybody agrees that part of the reason Canada has not been dragged down like many of the other countries is precisely because it had a much more regulated system, thanks to the role of the Bank of Canada, okay, the central bank in the case of Canada. So, the regulations might be inconvenient, they might be troublesome, but they certainly played a very important role in making Canada an exception in the North American continent.
Let's take two quick questions from Florum and then from Metro.
Ambassador Kamal, Florum will not be having questions, but I will, with your permission, turn it over to the Metropolitan Campus itself, if that's okay.
Metro. Yeah, Metro, two questions from Metro.
Yes, good afternoon, Ambassador. My name is Alex Alonso. I'm a freshman studying business and entrepreneurship here at Metropolitan. My question is in regard to the financial crisis in Europe. In the current financial crisis in the European Union, where we see Greece, Ireland, and now even Spain beginning to falter, does this mean we will continue to see a domino effect with the other countries in the European Union? What are the primary courses of action, if any, that we need to establish or pursue in order to stop the bleeding, so we're able to resolve this global financial crisis in the European Union?
And
second question.
And Ambassador Kamal, I'll take the opportunity to perhaps pose this question. And I do appreciate Secretary General Sundaram's comments thus far and presentation. And while perhaps we need to set up some future sessions on regulations and deregulations, because for perhaps every example of regulation, there have been very successful examples, counter-examples of deregulation even in this country, and perhaps have another session on whose fault is it that the Europeans are in a big mess. But my question goes back to the points that were raised, I think, by Ambassador Kamal, both by yourself and the Assistant Secretary General, regarding this notion of regulation, and if I can use the term, quote-unquote, smart regulation. So when we talk about it in the context of an overall global environment, and we are talking about the notion about trade flows or financial flows, and we argue about, well, it has so many detrimental effects, and so it needs to be regulated, needs to be controlled. What is that institution? What is that forum where these regulations should be enacted, and then who is going to be doing the implementation of the regulations? Because if you look at some examples, more recent examples, for instance, on global warming, we see the results of attempts to arrive at some global consensus about regulation is an issue. With ICANN, the more recent internet protocols, those itself are being co-opted by the various governments. So perhaps if you can speak to this, from the institutional standpoint, where is this? Is it going to be some supranational organization that is going to be enacting these regulations? How do they come about, and then who is enforcing them?
Great questions, because there are two separate points. The first is the problem between austerity and consumption. We were told that if you don't have money, you just have to tighten your belt and eat less because you just don't have the money. But then classical economics said, no, you should put in deficit financing. You should borrow money or print money in order to pump prime the development. But there are limits to how much you can do that, because you can get very deep into debt. So austerity or deficit financing is one question. And then the second question, which is fabulous, which you've heard. So the floor is yours.
Okay.
We have 3 minutes.
Well, since we have 3 minutes, let me be very, very brief. I'm sorry I cannot do justice to the very rich questions which have been raised, but such is life. The financial crisis in Europe is the real problem, as I hinted earlier, is that unlike in the US, unlike in Japan, countries in Europe are not borrowing in their own national currencies. That becomes the problem. If they were borrowing in their own national currencies, as in Japan, as in the United States, the problems would not arise. Because they borrow in euros, which the central banks do not issue themselves, then they are liable it's like another country borrowing US dollars or Japanese yen or something like that. And so the liabilities cannot be written down through central bank action. This is the big problem as far as Europe is concerned. So the perception, the domino effect, as you mentioned, is largely due to the fact that different countries in Europe are subject to the vagaries of financial markets. Financial markets are very, very fickle. You know, if a very successful or very popular finance minister gets ill, markets will move. Why? Because of the perception that finance minister is so responsible for stability in that country and so on and so forth. We should not be in such a situation. 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, we were not in such a situation. But today, unfortunately, we are in such a situation. And this is why I feel that one of our greatest problems is the power of markets and the fickleness of those markets. Professor Almeida raised the very difficult question of what would be the appropriate level of regulation. Most regulatory powers right now are, correctly or incorrectly, at the national level, at the central government level. Of course, there are local regulations, and there are few international regulations, but most are at the central government level. And so, trying to, for example, alter tax rules really requires legislation at the national level. There are some areas which you correctly identified as areas where the international cooperation is very necessary, and in those areas it's very, very difficult to come to any consensus, whether it's a question of global warming or the question of internet addresses and so on and so forth. But unfortunately, time has run out. I want to thank you all for this opportunity to talk with you about this range of subjects, and I hope I have been clear. I also would invite you to look at our website, where there's a great deal of information available on many of the issues which we have been discussing. And besides thanking you, I want to thank Ambassador Kamal for this opportunity to talk with all of you.
No,
thank you very much.
We who thank you for taking the trouble and the time to talk to all of us. And before I ask Professor Almeida to close from his end, I just want to share with all the 7 universities a secret, which is not really a secret, which is that Assistant Secretary General Sundaram is a candidate for the Director Generalship of the International Labour Organization, and all of us are praying that he succeeds in that candidature, because we cannot think of a better person to run that international organization. So good luck to you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Over to you, Professor Almeida, to close from your end.
And Ambassador Kamal, it's unfortunate that we do not have a vote, because I'm sure, speaking for the entire groups out here gathered, that the Assistant Secretary General would have our vote for that august body. On behalf of the Fairleigh Dickinson University's Office of Global Learning, we thank the Secretary General Sundaram for sharing some very insightful perspectives. I know the topic has been vast, but certainly it has It has helped my understanding of some of these issues, and I'm sure I can speak for some of my own students there, and as well as the other institutions that have joined us. And Ambassador Kamal, thank you again indeed for this opportunity, and we look forward to continuing and participating in these events. It's been a learning opportunity for our students, so thank you.
Goodbye from the Ambassadors Club.
Thank you.